A few years ago, researchers ran a simple workplace study. They tracked who got asked for favors most often inside a team, who absorbed extra work without being officially assigned it, and who ended the week feeling the most drained. It wasn't the laziest person on the team. It was the nicest one. And the kicker is that the nicest person also rated themselves as the least satisfied, the most resentful, and the most likely to be quietly considering quitting, despite never having said a single negative word to anyone. That finding doesn't make intuitive sense, and that's exactly why it's worth understanding. However, being too nice isn't a flaw in someone's character. It's a psychological pattern with a specific origin, a specific mechanism, and a very specific reason it keeps people locked in for years without them ever seeing it clearly. Before anything else, we need to separate two things that look identical on the surface but feel completely different underneath. Real kindness is a choice. You help because you want to, because it fits who you are, and because you have something genuine to give in that moment. Too nice operates differently. It's helping when you don't want to, agreeing when you actually disagree, going quiet to dodge conflict, and saying yes when every part of you is leaning toward no. Psychologists call this fawning, and it sits alongside fight, flight, and freeze as one of 4 documented stress responses. The fawn response was first described by therapist Pete Walker, who noticed that some people under chronic stress don't fight back and don't run. They please. They smooth things over. They become whatever the room seems to need, because somewhere along the way, their nervous system learned that being agreeable was the fastest path to safety. You're not being kind in that moment. You're running a survival program that forgot to check whether there was actually any danger. And the difference between those two things is the whole ball game. Nobody is born a people pleaser. It gets built. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby in the 1950s and later tested by Mary Ainsworth through her strange situation experiments, gives us the clearest picture of how children are biologically wired to attach to caregivers. That's not a preference. It's hardwired survival. And when that attachment feels unpredictable or conditional, when warmth and approval seem to shift based on behavior, children develop strategies to stabilize it. One of the most reliable strategies is becoming very, very easy to be around. Cooperative, agreeable, never demanding, never the source of friction. And that strategy, once it works once, gets reinforced. Then reinforced again, then again, until it stops feeling like a strategy at all and just becomes the operating system. But the roots go further back than any single childhood. For almost all of human evolutionary history, being pushed out of your group wasn't a social setback. It was a death sentence. There was no surviving the landscape alone. Your brain still carries that threat assessment, which is why social disapproval activates some of the same neural circuits as physical pain. Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA demonstrated this in 2003 using neuroimaging, and the finding has been replicated multiple times since. So when you shrink yourself to keep the peace, when you say yes to avoid an awkward moment, you're not being a pushover. You're responding to an alarm that's been in the human nervous system for tens of thousands of years. The alarm just doesn't know it's 2025. It can't tell the difference between my group might exile me and my coworker is mildly annoyed. It fires either way, and you comply either way. But wait, because this next part is where it goes from uncomfortable to genuinely unsettling. Nice people don't just drain themselves. They also broadcast a signal that certain people read very clearly. Social psychology calls this agreeableness exploitation, and the research behind it is worth knowing. People who score high in agreeableness, a real and measured dimension of the Big Five personality model, tend to be more cooperative, more generous, and significantly less likely to push back when someone takes more than their share. Studies in group settings consistently show they absorb more requests, more unpaid labor, and more emotional burden than their peers. The reason isn't that everyone around them is malicious. It's much more mundane than that. Human behavior, without any conscious intent, tends to move in the direction of least resistance. Nobody has to decide to exploit a nice person. The system just naturally loads more onto whoever isn't saying no. Water erodes soft soil, not because it chose to, but because that's where it flows. Now add in the smaller percentage of people who are more deliberate about it. Robert Hare, one of the most cited researchers in the study of psychopathy, spent decades documenting how manipulative individuals identify who they target. One of the most consistent patterns he found was a cluster of behaviors he described informally as the nice signal. People who smile too quickly, apologize too readily, and never quite push back. Those behaviors communicate something very legible in a social environment. This person will not resist. The vast majority of people pleasers never cross paths with someone like that. But for those who do, there's usually a familiar pattern afterward. The relationship changes, they eventually get out of it, and then years later they find themselves in a near-identical dynamic with a completely different person. Same structure, different name, same outcome. Same dynamic, different cast. Same ending, and here is the part that actually explains why this repeats. When someone has no visible limits, people who naturally respect limits stop checking in. They assume everything is fine because nothing's ever indicated otherwise. The ones who stay are the ones who benefit from everything staying exactly as it is. So over time, with no single dramatic event, you end up surrounded by relationships that only function because you don't have needs. And that stops feeling like a problem and starts feeling like just how things are. There's a specific psychological symptom that shows up in chronic people pleasers that most people don't know exists, and it's stranger than anything else in this video. When you ask them what they want, they go blank. Not shy, not polite, not worried about how it sounds, just blank. Like the question doesn't quite compute. Harriet Breicher documented this in her clinical research, and the explanation is straightforward once you see it. When a person has spent years suppressing their own preferences to manage everyone else's comfort, the habit of registering those preferences simply atrophies. The internal compass gets calibrated so completely to other people's reactions that it eventually loses its own sense of direction entirely. Clinical psychologists call this the erosion of authentic self. And it doesn't arrive dramatically. It builds across thousands of small moments, laughing at things you didn't find funny, agreeing to things you didn't want, staying quiet when you had something to say. Each one so minor it barely registers, and yet the accumulation of them over years is genuinely significant. And the consequences look, from the outside, completely unrelated to any of this. Research consistently links chronic people-pleasing patterns with elevated rates of anxiety and depression. The mechanism isn't complicated. Suppressing authentic emotion chronically and over long periods creates pressure that needs somewhere to go. It goes into resentment that builds quietly for months. It goes into passive aggression that the person can't fully account for. It goes into disproportionate reactions to small things, because small things become the last straw for someone who has been silently absorbing large things for a very long time. And then, reliably, comes the guilt about the reaction, which reinforces the belief that they need to be more patient, more giving, more accommodating, which tightens the whole cycle another notch. So, how does this actually change? Because just set boundaries is the most useless advice ever given to a people pleaser. And we can do better than that. Kindness, actual kindness, is one of the most well-documented strengths in psychology. Martin Seligman's work in positive psychology identified it as a core human strength with real, measurable effects on well-being. Genuine pro-social behavior reduces stress, strengthens relationships, and improves quality of life for both the person giving and the person receiving. So, none of this is an argument against being kind. Netta Weinstein and Richard Ryan at the University of Rochester found that the psychological benefits of helping others only materialize when the helping feels chosen rather than obligated. When you help because you genuinely want to, the well-being benefit is real and significant. When you help because you're afraid of what happens if you don't, the psychological profile flips, and the same behavior that builds you up in one context actively depletes you in the other. The behavior looks identical from the outside. The internal experience is completely opposite, and that internal experience is not fixed. People who develop clearer interpersonal limits consistently across multiple studies don't become less kind. they become more reliably kind over time, because they're giving from somewhere real rather than running on fumes and obligation. The empty cup metaphor is worn out at this point, but it's accurate. What it leaves out is that for a chronic people pleaser, the cup isn't just running low. It has a structural problem. You can pour into it constantly and it still empties faster than it should, because the issue isn't the input, it's the leak. Changing a pattern that's been running for a decade or two is not a quick process, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But there are real starting points, and they're more specific than learn to say no. The first is what therapists call noticing without acting. Before you can interrupt an automatic response, you have to be able to see it in real time. Try spending 1 week catching the moment right before you say yes to something you don't want to do. Don't change anything yet. Just notice what's happening internally. Is there relief at agreeing? Is there dread at the thought of any other answer? That internal data tells you whether you're choosing or just running the program. The second is attempting the smallest possible no on something genuinely low stakes. Not a confrontation, not a boundary-setting conversation, just a simple refusal with no apology and no explanation attached. I can't make it to that one. Then watch what happens. In almost every case, the world continues normally, and your nervous system needs to experience that, not just believe it intellectually, because the nervous system updates on evidence, not on reassurance. The third is learning to distinguish guilt from danger. People pleasers almost universally feel a surge of guilt when they prioritize themselves, and the nervous system reads that guilt as confirmation that they did something wrong. They didn't. In this context, guilt is usually the old pattern sounding an alarm because something unfamiliar just happened. The alarm doesn't mean stop. It means you moved. Feeling guilty doesn't mean you did something wrong. Sometimes it just means you did something different. You now know where the pattern comes from, why it gets reinforced, how it gets exploited, and what actually changes it. That's more than most people who have been living inside this pattern for years ever get. If you want to go deeper on the psychology underneath this, specifically why some people struggle to feel like they deserve the space they take up, that video is on screen right now.